For 2,000 years, the story of Scotland has been forged in fire and steel, from ancient tribes defending their homeland to kings and queens in stone castles, through revolutions of industry and the birth of a modern nation. This is the complete story of Scotland.
Tabor Scotland, the complete story of a nation, from ancient tribes to modern Scotland. Long before any kingdom claimed it, long before any castle crowned its hilltops or any army marched across its glens, Scotland was simply a landscape of extraordinary, almost violent beauty. The last great ice age, ending roughly 11,000 years ago, had done its slow and massive work across this northern land, carving the sea locks that bite deep into the western coastline, grinding down the ancient mountains of the Highlands into shapes that would eventually become among the most recognized silhouettes on Earth, depositing the fertile soils of the Central Belt where future generations would eventually build their greatest cities. As the ice retreated northward and temperatures gradually rose, life returned to Scotland's landscapes with remarkable speed. Birch and hazel forests crept northward across previously barren ground. Elk, wild cattle, and brown bears moved through woodland corridors behind the receding glaciers. And then, perhaps as early as 12,000 years ago, the first human beings arrived, moving northward from ice-free refuges further south, following game and coastlines into a land no human being had ever previously walked. These earliest Scots left behind traces that archaeology recovers with increasing sophistication: flint tools on coastal middens in Argyll, evidence of settlement on the island of Islay, the remains of meals eaten by people whose genetic descendants may still live in the same landscape their ancestors first explored after the ice. A wild land was waiting to be claimed. The first great cultures were beginning to emerge. Around 5,000 years ago, something remarkable was happening across Scotland's landscape that spoke to the organizational capability and spiritual ambition of Neolithic communities whose sophistication is easy to underestimate. These farming communities, who had introduced cattle, sheep, and grain cultivation to Scotland's previously hunter-gatherer landscape, were constructing monuments that required planning, collective labor, and conceptual ambition far exceeding anything practical necessity demanded. The Ring of Brodgar on Orkney, Callanish on Lewis, the Stones of Stennis, these extraordinary stone circles and standing stone alignments represented investments of community energy that tell us something profound about the worldview of the people who built them. Orkney during this period was particularly remarkable, functioning as what some archaeologists now describe as a significant ceremonial and cultural center for northern Britain, with settlements like Skara Brae, preserved beneath sand for 5,000 years until a storm revealed it in 1850, demonstrating domestic sophistication that challenges any condescending assumptions about prehistoric life. These communities grew grain, kept livestock, made pottery, conducted trade across significant distances, buried their dead in elaborate chambered cairns, and oriented their greatest constructions toward astronomically significant moments of the solar calendar. They left no written records to explain their thinking or identify their leaders. What they left instead, the stones themselves, standing in landscapes of haunting beauty after 5 millennia, communicates something that resists simple interpretation while demanding genuine respect. Powerful tribes were rising across a land still
The hide is
finding
ready
its
for the
identity.
frame. Good.
Among
I'll
the
prepare the
various
poles.
peoples who inhabited Scotland
We're
during
bringing in the
Iron
catch!
Age and into the early centuries of the first millennium, none have captured historical imagination quite so persistently as the Picts, the tribal confederacies of northern and eastern Scotland, who created one of the most distinctive artistic traditions in early medieval Europe, while leaving historians with enduring puzzles about their language, their social organization, and their ultimate historical fate. The Picts are known primarily through 3 kinds of evidence: Roman references describing the northern peoples their armies encountered and failed to subdue, the remarkable carved symbol stones that Pictish communities erected throughout their territories, decorated with intricate geometric designs, animal images of extraordinary quality, and symbols whose meaning has never been definitively decoded, and place names scattered throughout eastern Scotland that preserve faint linguistic echoes of a language that died without leaving any substantial written record. Their symbol stones, found throughout the landscape from Shetland to the southern Highlands, represent some of the finest artistic achievements of the early medieval British Isles. Their confident, accomplished execution suggesting a sophisticated artistic tradition supported by skilled specialists working within a society that valued and patronized such work. The Picts built impressive structures, including the circular stone towers called brocks, that still stand dramatically throughout northern Scotland, constructed without mortar through dry stone techniques of remarkable engineering quality. These were not simple, unsophisticated people living at the margins of European civilization. A mighty empire was approaching, and the Picts would show it exactly who it was dealing with. When Roman legions pushed northward into Scotland during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, they encountered something that had defeated no army in their conquest of Britain to that point: sustained, effective resistance from populations who understood their landscape's defensive potential and exploited it with relentless determination. The Emperor Hadrian, faced with the practical impossibility of occupying and pacifying the northern territories, responded in 122 AD by ordering the construction of the wall that bears his name across the narrowest point of northern England, an acknowledgement carved in stone that Rome's northward expansion had found its limit. His successor, Antoninus Pius, pushed the frontier northward again, constructing the Antonine Wall across the Scottish central belt between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde.
Brothers, the omens are clear. We march at dawn.
But this second frontier was even less sustainable than Hadrian's, abandoned within decades as the human and material costs of maintaining it exceeded any practical benefit the Northern Territory provided. Roman writers documented the northern peoples they encountered with a mixture of military respect and cultural condescension, inventing the term Caledonia for Scotland's territory and describing its inhabitants with the combination of awe and disparagement that Romans typically reserved for enemies who had frustrated imperial ambitions. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals that Roman influence on Scotland was more complex than simple military opposition, with Roman goods appearing throughout Scottish sites through trade and exchange that continued even during periods of military hostility. Rome retreated permanently. Scotland endured and remembered. In the centuries following Rome's withdrawal from Britain, Scotland's political landscape reorganized itself around several competing kingdoms, whose rivalries, alliances, and eventual consolidation gradually created something resembling a unified Scottish political identity. The kingdom of Dalriada straddled the narrow water between what is now Argyll and northeastern Ireland, establishing a Gaelic-speaking cultural and political community that proved extraordinarily influential in shaping Scotland's subsequent linguistic and cultural character. The monks of Iona,
we will not yield this land. Then you choose war. So be it.
Monastery in 563 AD spread Christianity throughout northern Britain with remarkable effectiveness. Their illuminated manuscripts and missionary networks connecting Scotland to the broader currents of early medieval Christian culture, while simultaneously creating an institutional presence that helped stabilize and organize the kingdoms they served. The Gaelic language, carried from Ireland by the Dalriatan community and spread northward and eastward through centuries of cultural contact, gradually absorbed or replaced earlier languages throughout much of Scotland, including eventually the Pictish language, whose disappearance remains one of early medieval Scotland's greatest historical mysteries. By the 9th century, the historical figure of Kenneth MacAlpin is traditionally associated with a unification of Pictish and Scottish Gaelic political authority, though the exact circumstances of how two previously competing peoples merged into a single kingdom called Alba remain genuinely debated among historians. New raiders were already approaching from the sea, about to test this fragile emerging unity severely. From the late 8th century onward, Scandinavian raiders appeared on Scotland's coastlines with the same devastating suddenness they brought to every other exposed North Atlantic community. Scotland's geography made it particularly vulnerable to Norse expansion, with its extensive island chains and deeply indented western coastline, providing
We will
countless
not
landing
yield
points and
this
sheltered
land.
anchorages
Then
that
you choose
longships could
war.
exploit with
So be
terrifying
it.
efficiency. The northern and western isles fell comprehensively under Norse control, with Orkney and Shetland becoming so thoroughly Scandinavian in population and culture that their place names today remain predominantly Norse rather than Gaelic, a linguistic record of settlement patterns established over 1,000 years ago that has proven remarkably resistant to subsequent change. Orkney became the base for the Norse earldom of Orkney, a political entity of genuine regional significance whose earls occasionally exercised power across substantial portions of northern Scotland, and whose sagas preserved a distinctive literary tradition celebrating their violent, ambitious world. The Hebrides remained contested between Norse and Gaelic political authority for centuries, their mixed cultural character producing the remarkable Hebridean material culture that combined Norse and Gaelic traditions in ways still visible in local custom, language, and identity. Yet even as Norse settlers transformed Scotland's island and coastal territories, the mainland kingdoms continued their gradual consolidation, adapting to Scandinavian presence through a combination of military resistance, diplomatic marriage, and cultural absorption that gradually incorporated Norse elements into an expanding Scottish identity without surrendering the Gaelic core that defined the kingdom's character. A unified kingdom was beginning to take definitive shape. The gradual unification of Scotland into a recognizable kingdom with defined territorial claims, functioning royal institutions, and acknowledged sovereignty over most of the modern country's geography was not the work of a single dramatic moment, but the cumulative achievement of multiple generations of medieval kings who extended royal authority, negotiated territorial claims, and occasionally fought to assert Scottish independence from the larger southern neighbor who periodically challenged it. Malcolm II's victory at Carham in 1018 effectively incorporated Lothian into the Scottish kingdom. The death of the last king of Strathclyde allowed the southwestern territories to come under Scottish royal authority. The Western Isles' complex relationship with Norway was eventually resolved through the Treaty of Perth in 1266, following the Battle of Largs, bringing the Hebrides under formal Scottish sovereignty. The royal court, itinerant throughout much of this period, gradually developed the administrative institutions, clerks, justiciars, sheriffs, that gave royal authority practical reach throughout the kingdom's growing territory. The church played a crucial role with the development of Scotland's ecclesiastical hierarchy and the establishment of major monastic houses, providing institutional infrastructure that supported royal governance while simultaneously connecting Scotland to the broader Latin Christian world of medieval Europe. By the late 13th century, Scotland functioned as a recognized sovereign kingdom within European political geography. Its independence, acknowledged by neighboring powers, and its institutions developed enough to sustain governance through the complex succession disputes that its position consistently generated. Its greatest challenge was now approaching with the force and deliberateness of a well-organized military campaign. The death of the child Queen Margaret in 1290 plunged Scotland into a succession crisis that Edward I of England exploited with the calculating ruthlessness of a ruler who had spent his career extending English royal power at every available opportunity. Edward's intervention in the Scottish succession dispute, initially as an apparently
glory and plunder!
transformed rapidly into a campaign for outright conquest after installing John Balliol as a compliant Scottish king proved insufficiently satisfying. When Scottish resistance crystallized and open warfare began, the conflict that followed produced two of Scottish national memory's most enduring figures. William Wallace, whose social origins remain genuinely obscure, emerged from relative anonymity to lead Scottish resistance with a ferocity and military effectiveness that culminated in the remarkable victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297, where a Scottish force destroyed a larger and better equipped English army through tactical brilliance and exploitation of terrain. His eventual capture and brutal execution in 1305, hanged, drawn, and quartered in London, transformed him from a military leader into a martyr whose memory continued inspiring Scottish resistance long after his death. Robert Bruce, whose political journey through the Wars of Independence involved compromises and reversals that later admirers sometimes preferred to overlook, ultimately committed himself to Scottish independence and demonstrated the strategic patience and military capability to make that commitment effective. The victory at Bannockburn.
Warriors of Alba, today we unite! From this day, Scotland stands as one!
United! Secured Scottish independence in practical military terms. Victory had been achieved. The responsibilities it brought were formidable. The landscape of medieval Scotland was defined physically and psychologically by its castles, those dramatic concentrations of stone and military engineering that served simultaneously as military strongpoints, administrative centers, aristocratic residences, and visual statements about power, whose messages were legible to everyone who saw them, rising above the surrounding landscape. Scotland's topography proved extraordinarily well-suited to castle construction, with dramatic rocky outcrops, river confluences, and coastal promontories providing natural defensive advantages that Scottish builders exploited with imagination and consistent strategic intelligence. Edinburgh Castle on its volcanic rock, Stirling Castle, commanding the gateway between the Scottish Lowlands and Highlands, Urquhart Castle on the shores of Loch Ness, Eilean Donan in the Western Highlands, Dunnottar clinging to a coastal cliff in Aberdeenshire. These and dozens of other fortifications created a network of defended strongpoints throughout the kingdom that gave medieval Scottish governance much of its practical character. Control of key castles determined military outcomes in the Wars of Independence as critically as any field battle, with sieges of Edinburgh, Stirling, and other major fortifications constituting as important a strand of the conflict as the famous encounters at Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn. The castles also served as the physical settings for royal politics of increasing complexity and occasional lethal drama, their great halls hosting the feasts, councils, and confrontations through which medieval Scotland's governing class conducted the business of power. Royal politics were growing considerably more dangerous as the century advanced. The Stuart dynasty, the royal house that governed Scotland from Robert II's accession in 1371 through centuries of turbulent monarchy, produced a succession of rulers whose combined historical record encompasses remarkable achievement alongside personal tragedy at a frequency that seems almost designed for dramatic storytelling. James I, held captive in England for 18 years before returning to govern Scotland with reforming energy and authoritarian methods, was assassinated in 1437. James II was killed by an exploding cannon at the Siege of Roxburgh in 1460. James III's troubled reign ended in circumstances following the Battle of Sauchiburn in 1488 that remain historically murky. James IV, perhaps the most accomplished Renaissance monarch Scotland produced, died at Flodden in 1513 in one of the most catastrophic military defeats Scotland ever suffered, with him
for Scotland!
Much of the Scottish nobility.
United we
the dynasty,
stand!
Nevertheless,
Scotland united!
With the kingdom reconstituting itself around each successive Stuart minority and finding in its worst crises an institutional depth that allowed governance to continue. James V's daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, became one of history's most romanticized and analyzed figures. Her personal drama, her marriages, her flight to England, her long imprisonment, and her eventual execution ordered by Elizabeth I, making her simultaneously a symbol of Stuart tragedy and an endlessly compelling human story. Her son, James VI, would eventually inherit the English throne in 1603, uniting the crowns while keeping the kingdoms legally separate. Faith and politics were about to collide with consequences that would transform Scotland permanently. The Protestant Reformation arrived in Scotland during the 1550s and 1560s as both a genuinely popular religious movement and a political revolution whose consequences restructured Scottish society from its foundations. John Knox, returning from exile fired with Calvinist conviction acquired during years in Geneva under Calvin himself, preached the new faith with rhetorical force that drew massive crowds and inspired the
for
kind
Scotland!
of passionate commitment that could topple
United we
institutions
stand!
standing for centuries.
Scotland united!
The Scottish parliaments, formal adoption of Protestant confession in 1560 represented one of the most decisive single legislative moments in Scottish history, simultaneously ending papal authority in Scotland, dismantling the institutional Catholic Church, and establishing the Presbyterian model of church government, authority exercised by elders and assemblies rather than bishops appointed by Crown, that would eventually become the Church of Scotland's defining characteristic. This Presbyterian ecclesiology had political implications extending far beyond purely theological questions, establishing a tradition of representative governance within the Church that consistently complicated royal attempts to control Scottish religious life and contributed to the 17th century conflicts that eventually produced constitutional settlement limiting royal authority. The physical consequences of the Reformation included the destruction of church furnishings, statues, and artwork throughout Scotland, as reforming communities stripped the visual culture of medieval Catholicism from their local kirks with thoroughness that permanently altered the character of Scottish religious space. From this transformed religious and cultural landscape, something remarkable was preparing to emerge. Scotland's greatest minds were about to step forward onto the world's stage. During the 18th century, Scotland experienced an intellectual flowering so concentrated and so influential that its geographical origins in a small northern nation still provoked
Warriors of the
genuine
Highlands and
astonishment
Lowlands,
among
hear
those
me!
encountering its
From this
scale
ancient
for the first
rock,
time.
we march as one.
The Scottish
For
Enlightenment
Scotland,
centered
charge!
primarily on Edinburgh and Glasgow, but drawing upon a broader national culture that valued education with unusual intensity, produced contributions to human knowledge whose impact was global and whose legacy continues actively shaping the modern world. David Hume's philosophical skepticism and empirical approach to knowledge made him one of the most important philosophers in Western history, his work influencing Kant, who credited Hume with waking him from dogmatic slumber. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, founded the discipline of economics and provided intellectual frameworks for understanding market systems that continue generating debate and application more than 2 centuries later. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine, developed partly through his association with Glasgow's university community, provided the key technological enabler for the Industrial Revolution that would reshape the entire world. Joseph Black's discovery of late latent heat, James Hutton's foundational work in geology, William Cullen's contributions to chemistry and medicine, each represented genuine advances in human understanding produced by a nation whose commitment to education, particularly through its network of universities and parish schools, created unusually favorable conditions for intellectual achievement. Scotland was demonstrating that small nations could produce ideas big enough to change the entire world. Industry was arriving to test whether those ideas could be practically applied. The Industrial Revolution transformed Scotland with particular intensity in the western lowlands around Glasgow, where the combination of coal deposits, iron ore, water power, navigable rivers, and an entrepreneurial commercial culture created conditions for industrial development of extraordinary scale and speed. Glasgow's population exploded from perhaps 30,000 people in 1750 to over 300,000 by 1850, and continued growing throughout the 19th century as workers flooded in from Scotland's rural regions, from Ireland, and, eventually from further afield, to work in the textile mills, iron foundries, chemical works, and eventually the shipyards that made Clydeside synonymous with industrial production on a world-changing scale. The social consequences of this rapid industrialization were as profound as the economic ones. With overcrowded urban housing, polluted air and water, dangerous working conditions, and the disruption of traditional community structures creating genuine suffering alongside the wealth that industrial productivity generated for factory owners and merchants. Scotland's Highlands experienced a different but equally devastating form of economic transformation during this same period, as landlords pursuing agricultural improvement and sheep farming cleared tenant communities from their traditional lands in the processes known as the Highland clearances, forcing mass emigration to cities, to other parts of Britain, and particularly to North America and Australasia, where Scottish diaspora communities established themselves throughout the 19th century with cultural tenacity that preserved distinct Scottish identities far from their origins. Modern Scotland was being born through both the creative destruction of industrialization and the painful dispersal of traditional communities. The age of ships, steel, and steam was about to announce Scotland's global industrial ambition. At its Victorian peak, the Clyde Valley's industrial complex was producing results that made Glasgow genuinely claim the title of Second City of the British Empire, with something more than civic boosterism. The shipbuilding industry that developed along the River Clyde during the 19th century became the world's most productive, with Clydeside yards at various points building between a quarter and a third of the entire world's shipping tonnage, their output feeding the global expansion of maritime trade that the Victorian age required. The names of ships launched from Clyde yards, including the Lusitania, the Queen Mary, and the Queen Elizabeth, became globally recognized, their scale and quality representing Scottish engineering excellence at its most impressive. Scottish civil engineers, trained within an educational tradition that combined theoretical understanding with practical application, designed bridges, railways, harbors, and infrastructure throughout the British Empire and beyond, their professional networks carrying Scottish technical expertise to every inhabited continent. James Nasmyth's steam hammer, Kirkpatrick Macmillan's bicycle, John Logie Baird's television, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. The list of Scottish technological innovations during this period is long enough to justify genuine national pride while also reflecting the particular conditions that Scottish education, industrial culture, and intellectual tradition had created for practical problem-solving. Scotland was powering a changing world with an energy and inventiveness that would have astonished the Pictish communities who had resisted Roman legions on these same landscapes 2,000 years earlier. Then, conflict returned, demanding something different from Scotland's people. Scotland's contribution to both world wars was, measured proportionally against its population, among the most significant of any nation involved in those devastating conflicts. Scottish regiments, the Black Watch, the Gordon Highlanders, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the Royal Scots, and many others, maintained fighting traditions that stretched back centuries while experiencing the industrial-scale slaughter of 20th century warfare with the same collective suffering as soldiers from every other nation. Scottish communities lost sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands in numbers that left permanent marks on village war memorials throughout the country. The carved names on those stones representing proportional losses that make any honest engagement with the period genuinely affecting. The industrial infrastructure of Clydeside proved as militarily significant as the soldiers Scotland sent to the fronts, with shipyards, munitions factories, and engineering works operating around the clock throughout both wars to provide the military hardware that sustained extended industrial warfare. Clydeside workers' militancy during the First World War, resisting dilution of skilled labor and poor working conditions while demanding fairer treatment from government and employers, created the political tradition associated with Red Clydeside that influenced Scottish and British left-wing politics for decades. The Second World War brought bombing raids to Clydeside, with the Clydebank Blitz of March 1941 devastating that town with particular ferocity. Yet Scotland emerged from both wars with its essential character intact, its communities scarred but resilient, and its determination to build a better society, subsequently expressed through enthusiastic support for the welfare state that the post-war settlement established. A new Scotland was genuinely emerging. Contemporary Scotland is a nation of fascinating contrasts and productive tensions, its daily life shaped by the accumulated weight of the extraordinary history examined in previous chapters, while simultaneously reaching toward futures that previous generations could not have imagined. Scotland's devolution settlement, establishing the Scottish Parliament in 1999 for the first time since the Acts of Union in 1707, had merged the Scottish and English parliamentary institutions, represented the most significant constitutional change in Scottish governance for 3 centuries, restoring domestic legislative authority over matters including health, education, justice, and agriculture to an elected body sitting in Edinburgh. The debates around Scottish independence that have characterized recent decades, whatever their eventual constitutional resolution, reflect a national conversation about identity, sovereignty, and the relationship between Scotland and its neighbors that engages citizens with a depth and seriousness that perhaps only a nation whose independence was so hard-won could sustain. Scottish cities demonstrate resilience and reinvention in ways that parallel the broader national story. Glasgow's transformation from industrial decline through cultural regeneration, announced most visibly by its designation as European City of Culture in 1990, demonstrated that post-industrial cities could rebuild their identities around creativity, education, and service economies without surrendering the working-class pride and communal solidarity that their industrial histories had forged. Edinburgh's continuing international prominence as a festival city, financial center, and knowledge economy hub reflects a different but equally determined adaptation to contemporary circumstances. Scotland was preserving its heritage while building its future. The Highlands and Islands waited to tell their own essential part of the story. No honest account of Scotland can be complete without dwelling upon the landscapes that have shaped its identity as profoundly as any battle or parliament or intellectual movement. The mountains, glens, sea lochs, and islands of the Highlands and Islands that constitute perhaps the most emotionally powerful natural environment anywhere in Europe. The Highlands cover roughly half of Scotland's total land area, while housing only a small fraction of its population. Their dramatic topography, the direct legacy of geological forces and glacial sculpting that created a landscape of extraordinary visual power from ancient, worn-down mountain routes that were once as tall as the modern Alps. Loch Ness, the Great Glen, Rannoch Moor, the Cairngorm Plateau, Glencoe with its tragic historical associations, these places function within Scottish culture as both physical realities and powerful symbols, their meanings accumulated through centuries of association with moments of the national story that continue resonating. The Highland diaspora, created by the clearances, spread Scottish Highland culture throughout North America, Australasia, and elsewhere, where subsequent generations maintained connections to ancestral landscapes through the Highland games, pipe bands, clan societies, and cultural institutions that preserved identity across oceanic distances. The Gaelic language, which once covered most of Scotland's geography and survives today primarily in the Western Isles and parts of the Highland mainland, represents a living connection to Scotland's pre-medieval cultural roots that ongoing government support and community determination have kept from the extinction that economic and social pressures threatened throughout the 20th century. Scotland's influence extended far beyond its geographic borders in ways that this Highland connection helped explain. The list of Scottish contributions to global civilization is long enough to seem almost implausible when encountered in concentrated form, yet the historical evidence for each entry is entirely genuine and sometimes literally world-changing in its documented impact. Medicine and surgery, from the development of antiseptic technique by Joseph Lister through penicillin's discovery by Alexander Fleming to countless contributions from Edinburgh's famous medical school, constitute perhaps the most directly life-saving dimension of Scotland's global legacy, with the number of human lives saved by these discoveries incalculable in any meaningful sense. Engineering achievements: Watt's steam engine, Telford's roads and bridges, Macadam's road surfacing, the Forth Bridge, Logie Baird's television, established Scottish engineers as indispensable contributors to the physical infrastructure of the modern world. Literary contributions ranging from Robert Burns, whose poetry transcends national boundaries to speak to universal human experiences of love, nature, and dignity, through Sir Walter Scott, whose historical novels invented a new genre, to the contemporary crime fiction of Ian Rankin that has made Edinburgh's streets familiar to readers worldwide, established Scotland's literary tradition as one of European literature's most distinctive voices. The Scottish diaspora carried these contributions globally, with Scottish communities in North America, Australasia, and throughout the former British Empire maintaining cultural connections that ensured Scottish influences permeated societies their ancestors had helped build across the world's most distant corners. One final chapter remained to gather all these threads into a fitting conclusion. Behind the castles and the battlefields, beneath the philosophical treatises and the engineering blueprints, supporting the great institutions and the celebrated individuals whose names fill history books, there have always been the ordinary people of Scotland, whose daily lives constitute the actual substance of the national story that historians attempt to capture. The crofting families of the Highlands who maintained their communities across centuries of hardship with a dignified tenacity that the clearances could displace but could not entirely defeat. The industrial workers of Glasgow and Dundee and Motherwell, whose physical labor drove the machinery that gave Scotland its Victorian reputation for practical, world-changing productivity. The fisherwomen of the East Neuk of Fife and the Moray Firth, who baited the lines, processed the catches, and maintained the household economies that sustained coastal communities across generations of uncertain livelihoods. The teachers in Scotland's parish schools, whose commitment to education for all social levels, regardless of ability to pay, created the unusually broad educational access that produced the Enlightenment thinkers, the engineering innovators, and the literary voices that Scotland contributed so disproportionately to the world. The immigrant communities, Irish, Jewish, Italian, South Asian, and many others, who brought their own cultural energies to Scottish cities and created hybrid communities whose blend of traditions enriched the nation they had adopted. These unnamed millions are the actual builders of everything that the name Scotland evokes. The full story now gathers itself for its concluding reflection. Mountains stood in Scotland long before any kingdom claimed them. Ancient, worn-down ranges of some of Earth's oldest exposed rock, shaped by forces operating on timescales that make all of human history seem brief. Those mountains watched the first human beings arrive after the ice retreated, watched Pictish symbol stones being carved with confident artistry, watched Roman legions march to the limits of their empire and turn back. They watched medieval kings consolidate fragile kingdoms and saw the wars of independence forge national identity through collective suffering and hard-won victory. They stood silent witness to the Scottish Enlightenment's extraordinary intellectual flowering, to the industrial transformation that turned Clyde mud into ocean liners, to the highland clearances that emptied glens which had sustained human communities for millennia. Castles rose and fell around their bases. Religious reformations transformed the spiritual life of communities sheltering in their shadows. Empires challenged Scotland's borders repeatedly and found them more resilient than anticipated. Ideas emerged from Edinburgh drawing rooms and Glasgow University lecture halls that crossed oceans to reshape how humanity understood itself, organized its economies, and treated its sick. Through every triumph and every hardship, every political transformation, and every technological revolution, Scotland retained something essential about its character, a fierce attachment to its own identity, a stubborn refusal to be defined entirely by larger neighbors or broader historical forces, a creativity that flourished most productively precisely when circumstances seemed most constrained. Its story is not only the story of a nation, it is the story of resilience, imagination, and the enduring spirit of its people.